Vladimir Vladimirovich, we just observed your meeting on rare earth metals. Excuse me, but I think that right now, journalists around the world are interested in rare earth metals, though in a slightly different context. The United States, to put it very mildly, is strongly urging Zelensky to sign an agreement with them regarding these resources as payment for the aid Ukraine previously received from the Biden administration. How do you assess the prospects of such an agreement?
That doesn't concern us. I don't assess it in any way and don't even want to think about it. Of course, it would be necessary to evaluate these resources, how real they are, how much of them exist, what they are worth, and so on. But again, I repeat, this is not our business. Our business is what we just discussed at the meeting. Rare and rare earth metals are a very important component, very important resources for modern industries. So far, we have done little in this area, but we need to do more. The purpose of today's meeting was to focus administrative resources in the initial stage on this direction. By the way, we would be willing to offer cooperation to our American partners as well. And when I say partners, I mean not only government and administrative structures, but also companies, if they were interested in joint work. We undoubtedly have an order of magnitude, let me emphasize this, an order of magnitude more of such resources than Ukraine. Russia is one of the undisputed leaders in rare and rare earth metal reserves. We have them in the north, in Murmansk, in the Caucasus, in Kabardino-Balkaria, in the Far East, in the Irkutsk region, as well as in Yakutia and Tuva. These are quite capital-intensive investments, capital-intensive projects. We would be happy to work jointly with any foreign partners, including American ones. And, by the way, regarding the new territories, the same applies. We are ready to attract foreign partners. The so-called new historical territories that have returned to the Russian Federation also have certain reserves. We are ready to work with our foreign partners, including Americans, there as well.
In the new regions as well?
Yes, of course.
These days we are seeing a barrage of statements and discussions, and everyone is talking about Trump, why he is speaking so harshly, saying that Zelensky must hold elections and that his approval rating is at 4%. Europeans are heavily criticizing Trump for these statements. And now there are opinions that the current approach of the US president is actually playing into Russia's hands. Do you think that's the case?
I believe that is absolutely not the case. I have my own perspective on this, which is the opposite of what you just described. The fact is, the current head of the Kyiv regime is becoming a toxic figure for Ukraine's armed forces because he issues absurd orders that are not driven by military considerations, but by political ones. And it's unclear what they are even based on. This is leading to unjustifiably high losses, if not enormous or even catastrophic losses, for the Ukrainian army. He is also becoming toxic to society as a whole. I believe this is reflected in today's vote in the Rada on extending his powers. Finally, he has cornered himself with his decree banning negotiations with the Russian Federation on a peace deal, effectively shutting down those talks. The issue here is that he is avoiding negotiations. Why? Because if negotiations begin sooner or later, and most likely quite quickly, it will lead to the necessity of lifting martial law. And as soon as that happens, elections will have to be held. There will be no grounds to postpone elections anymore because, right now, they are not being held under the pretext of martial law. But if negotiations start and the quick cancellation of martial law follows, elections will have to take place immediately. and this presents a serious problem for the current head of the regime. Because in reality, it doesn't matter whether his approval rating is 4% or something else. What matters is that, according to our data, which is objective, his rating is exactly half that of his closest potential political rival. That would be Mr. Zelenskyy, the former commander of Ukraine's armed forces, who has been sent into exile in London. His approval rating is twice as high. And if we add to this the potential support that this candidate could receive from other political figures, including former prime ministers or former presidents, then the current head of the regime has absolutely no chance of winning an election. His chances are zero. Unless, of course, the results are blatantly rigged. But even that would be bad for him because it would be too obvious. So, he is a factor in the deterioration of the army, society, and the state itself. And the current U.S. President, Trump, surely understands this and is pushing him toward elections. As I see it, Trump wants to improve the political situation in Ukraine, consolidate society, and create conditions for the survival of the Ukrainian state. And overall, this is not so much a benefit to Russia. After all, our conflict is with the current regime, but rather a benefit to Ukraine itself. Besides everything else, the current U.S. president has announced that he wants to achieve peace. As a matter of fact, so do we, and as soon as possible. However, the current head of the regime stands in the way of achieving this goal. This, in my view, explains the position of the U.S. president. And it is not related to serving Russian interests. Rather, it is likely in the interests of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian state, aiming to preserve its statehood. We have nothing against that either. Although, of course, we would like this territory not to be used as a staging ground for attacks on the Russian Federation, not to be used as a hostile base against us, but ultimately to become a friendly neighboring state.
Every day we hear a wide range of statements from Trump. You have met with him multiple times, and you recently had a phone conversation with him. Does he act based on emotions?
Of course not. Naturally, the current head of the Kyiv regime gives him reasons to display emotions. But from what I have just said, a different picture emerges. His actions are based not on emotions, but on cold calculation, on a rational approach to the current situation. Paradoxically, to be honest, we were actually interested in him staying in power and continuing to erode the regime with which we are in armed conflict. But from the perspective of strengthening Ukrainian statehood, it is clear that a different approach is needed, one that moves in an entirely different direction, bringing to power people who will have the trust of the Ukrainian people.
Do you think European leaders understand the current dynamics surrounding Ukraine?
You would have to ask them. Judging by their actions, I don't think they fully understand. But that is not even the main issue. The key point is that, unlike the new U.S. president, political leaders of European countries are deeply tied to the current regime. They are committed to it. They have said and promised too much, and now, excuse my bluntness, backing out of this position is very difficult for them, if not practically impossible, without losing face. And considering that they are in a rather complicated and politically sensitive period, facing elections, re-elections, parliamentary challenges, and so on. It is nearly impossible for them to change their position under these circumstances. Unlike them, the current President of the United States, the newly elected President, has his hands free. He is not bound by these constraints that prevent progress and hinder efforts to resolve the conflict. It is in his character, perhaps. He acts straightforwardly and without much hesitation. His position is unique. He not only says what he thinks, but he says whatever he wants. Well, that is a privilege of the leader of one of the world's great powers.
A few days ago in St. Petersburg, I asked you about how everyone now wants to have a say in Russian-American negotiations. Yet the Europeans continue to insist and demand a voice in negotiations over Ukraine. How do you view this?
I don't see anything wrong with that. But no one can really demand anything here, especially from Russia. Let them demand from someone else. For centuries, they demanded anything they wanted from their vassals, but now demands are being made of them. So let them sit at home with their demands and think about how they ended up in this situation. However, their participation in the negotiation process is, of course, in demand. And we have never refused them. We have always maintained discussions with them. At some point, under various contrived ideas of defeating Russia on the battlefield, they themselves refuse to engage with us. If they want to return, go ahead. I saw the reaction to both my phone conversation with the U.S. President and the high-level meeting in Riyadh. It was indeed emotional and lacked any practical meaning. Why? Because in order to resolve complex and even acute issues, including those related to Ukraine, both Russia and the United States must take the first step. What does that step entail? It should be aimed at increasing the level of trust between both states. That is precisely what we were engaged in at the Riyadh meeting, and that is what upcoming high-level contacts may focus on. Without this, it is impossible to resolve any issue, especially one as complex and sensitive as the Ukrainian crisis. But what do the Europeans have to do with this? This is a matter of bilateral Russian-American relations. Why are they needed here? What will they be doing? Incidentally, during both the phone conversation and the meeting in Riyadh, the Ukrainian crisis was, of course, mentioned, but it was not substantively discussed. We only agreed that we would approach it in due time. In this sense, and in this case, of course, we do not rule out the participation of European countries. I want to emphasize that we also respect the position of our friends in BRICS, who have formed a group of peace supporters. Just today, I spoke with the President of the People's Republic of China, and we discussed this as well. He informed me that the Friends of Peace group in New York will soon meet again to discuss this issue. We not only welcome, but are also grateful to all our partners who raise these issues and strive to achieve peace. Why am I saying this? Not only Europeans, but other countries also have the right and the ability to participate. And we treat this with respect.
I'd like to ask you to comment on a few more statements by Trump. There have been quite a lot, as I mentioned.
But not all of them, okay?
Not all of them. For example, he said he wants to propose to you and the Chinese leader to cut defense budgets in half. What do you think of this idea?
I know about it, and I can guess what it's based on. It is probably based on calculations from one of the British research centers, which estimated our expenses in terms of purchasing power parity. Last year, the U.S. had, I believe, already reached 968 billion, and if you combine Russian and Chinese expenditures, the figures roughly match. Russia and China together are comparable to U.S. spending. First of all, we need to verify these calculations. The British Center's estimates may be accurate, or they may be imprecise or completely incorrect. We need to look into that. That's the first point. Secondly, I cannot comment on how the People's Republic of China will respond to this. There have been various U.S. approaches regarding strategic offensive weapons and other serious matters, so that is up to China. However, as for us, we could negotiate with the United States. We are not against it. I think the idea is a good one. If the United States were to reduce its defense budget by 50%, we would reduce ours by 50%, and then China could join in if it wished. We consider this proposal a good one and are open to discussions on the matter.
Trump also imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from all countries. We used to have good cooperation with the U.S. on aluminum. What do you think of this trade policy?
Right now, I don't want to comment on U.S. trade policy. It has been tied to sanctions for many years. We consider these sanctions illegal and harmful to global trade and the economy. In my opinion, they damage both us and those who impose them. As for trade policy, higher tariffs, duties, and so on, each country determines for itself what is beneficial and what is not. I understand the logic behind it: to bring production back home, create jobs, ensure tax payments at all levels, and so on. But at some point, these measures will inevitably face certain difficulties, such as inflationary pressure, rising product costs, and so forth. But that's something the experts can explain to you in detail. As for aluminum, in 2017, if I remember correctly, we supplied about 15% of total U.S. aluminum imports. Approximately 15% came from Russia. In general, the U.S. produces about 60% of the aluminum it needs domestically, while 40% is imported. Of that, 15% used to come from the Russian Federation. Today, the main importer is Canada. If the decision were made to open the U.S. market to our producers, we could sell approximately 2 million tons on the American market. This would not have a significant impact on price formation, but, in my opinion, would still have a stabilizing effect on price levels. More importantly, in my view, is that we could explore joint efforts with American companies in this sector. For instance, back in Soviet times, there were plans to build a new hydroelectric power station in the Krasnoyarsk region and expand aluminum production there. After all, aluminum is primarily about energy, and preferably cheap energy. Hydroelectric power is both inexpensive and environmentally friendly. These plans, dating back to Soviet times, still exist. However, they are capital-intensive and require significant investment. By preliminary estimates, such a project would cost around $15 billion in today's prices. But it is worth considering. Yes, the current U.S. president's policy is focused on relocating production within the United States. However, if American companies operate in Russia, that would also be beneficial, and significantly so. These companies would earn substantial profits, and the corresponding volumes of aluminum would be supplied to the domestic market at fully reasonable market prices. There is much to consider here, including cooperation on rare earth metals and other areas, such as energy.
By the way, just a few minutes ago, I read a fresh report from the U.S. President Trump announced that the U.S. and Russia are discussing major economic projects as part of negotiations on Ukraine.
Yes, some of our companies are in contact with each other and are discussing such projects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.